right, so here we are. Happy spring. First of all, I wanted to just spend a couple of moments on the national initiatives about getting out the vote. You will have gotten an email April 7th from Shannon Wolf, and in the subject line, it talks about vote now to shape AAW's future. I wanted to comment that there are three components to this vote. First of all, you can vote on the National Board of Directors. If you would like more information about any of the candidates, click Profile. Secondly, of course, is the eliminate the degree requirement. This has also been referred to as the Open Membership Initiative, and that we had a very, very nice presentation at last month's board meeting to establish the reasons for that and the rationale to be a more inclusive organization. And the third component of the vote is going to be changing the bylaws. There's some pretty significant language changes proposed, and if you'd like a little bit more about that, you can click on proposed changes. It's very, very easy to vote. It's simple. You open up the email, click Vote Now, you validate your name and your address, things of that sort, and they're very important initiatives. And the bottom line, your vote will only count if you vote. Save the date, Thursday, May 13th. I think we're all familiar of the Fair Maps initiative that we all count. There's a Zoom meeting at 6:30. Watch for more registration. There'll be an article in the Postgraduate. It's about the Fair Maps Toolkit. Followed by that, relating to that, Can You Hear Us Now is a documentary about 4 women, and it's specific about the state of Wisconsin. So if you'd like a sneak preview, there's going to be a special showing on demand between Sunday, April 25th and Thursday, April 29th. Once again, there'll be some registration information that'll be pushed out, and there'll be a panel discussion on Thursday, April 29th from 6:30 to 7:30. This is our public policy actively engaged and at work. And of course, tonight, we're very, very excited to have Ginny Finn, President and CEO of the YWCA. Her topic tonight is going to be courageous reflections and candid conversation on racism. The author's tea, it's back on. We are so looking forward to this. Carol Damian will be leading this effort. October 16th, if you'd like to think about hosting a table, you can contact Carol, and all of the monies that are raised go to local scholarships. Please review your dues promptly. Kathy Schultz has sent out an email to everyone. The dues is $98, which is some phenomenal bargain, including your national, state, and branch membership. You certainly get a lot of bang for the buck for that $98. So please renew your membership. Save the date, May 22nd. We're going to hear a little bit more about this, but it's a walk and a fundraiser planned at Foxbrook. And Carol Damian will share a little bit more about that. Followed by the Punch Bowl invite. This has already been pushed out, and we will also hear a little bit of an update about the West Suburban Reads joining Inside Out. And so we'll hear a little bit more about that in announcements. We need your favorite recipes. The fundraising committee is at it again. AAUW is going to resurrect the cookbook. It's a fundraiser, and we're looking for your favorite family and friend tested recipes for our cookbook. Appetizers, beverages, breads, lunch, brunch, doesn't matter, some salads, some main courses. Emily Siebers is going to be compiling the recipes. Now you can email her today, tomorrow, the next day, or just get them in by June 15th. Our goal is to get 2 recipes or more from each member. Linda Plew has already committed for me my 2 recipes, I might say. And don't miss this. I tell you, this is the state convention just right around the corner, April 23rd and 24th. It's all virtual. It's free. It should be a lot of fun. And by the way, ladies, there is a silent auction. You certainly don't want to miss that. AAUW elections. Vote for the board by noon, April 23rd. We will be pushing out an email blast, and watch for some details upcoming. Okay, here we go. Jill Myers had her baby. Jill is here tonight. That is just simply amazing. I got to give a little question to Linda Pluitt. Do we have a baby membership? Let's look at that, Linda. Okay, Mother's Day, May 9th, right around the corner. Invest in the future with Shady Lanes. They have been so generous that every time your family or friend that they shop there, they can have a give back of 25% of regularly priced items. You just need to mention AAUW to the salesperson. What a great deal. And thank you, Shady Lanes, for your generosity. Put this one on your calendar. I tell you, Lynn Ziegler and that gardening club, they're always up to something. You know, this is August 19th, but every month they have something going on. But this is one you won't want to miss at Christopher Farms and Garden Tour. And they're also looking at having a pizza buffet lunch. So keep that one in mind. And of course, we always want to remember to donate to the RBG Scholarship Fund. And the May 12th branch meeting, that is our topic, is going to be navigating the challenges and opportunities of working in a male-dominated environment. Our guest speaker is going to be Edith Hudson. She's the chief of police at Marquette University and has been in law enforcement for several decades. That should be a phenomenal meeting. And of course, watch your inbox. This is just simply a reminder of how the postgraduate comes in your inbox, so you can kind of watch for it. That is just always a chock full of great information. And keep current at our website. Just as a reminder, you can always go to our website and see what else is going on in our branch. And then there's a lot of excellent links to other activities and events that might be of interest to everyone. Okay, well, that's a wrap. Now, how many? We have 47 people that have signed on. That is absolutely incredible.
It looks like we're still admitting some, Mary.
Okay, that's great. Well, now we're up to 48. So once again, ladies, welcome to the April branch meeting. Although I might say the weather today kind of suggests it might be the November branch meeting. It's unbelievably chilly out there. My name's Mary Messerly, and on behalf of Kirsten Lanther and myself, we would like to welcome you to tonight's meeting. It certainly is great to see everyone. We have two very important business actions tonight. Number one is we're going to review and vote on our 2021 and 22 budget. Number two, we're going to review and vote on our 2021 and 22 slate of officers. After that, we will have a couple of very, very brief, cool announcements, and then we will get into tonight's featured program with Ginny Finn. It's a pleasure to introduce our amazing and fiscally responsible Kathy Schultz. She is going to walk us through the budget. Immediately following that, we will have a poll that we will be able to vote on the budget tonight. Kathy?
Okay, Mary's going to put up the budget so that you can see it. And as soon as that's up, you won't be seeing me, you'll see the budget. Okay. So what you're going to see is in the left-hand column is the budget we're operating under this year. In the right-hand column is the proposed budget for next year. And anything that's highlighted in yellow in the right-hand column means that there is a change. It's either up or down, but there is a change between them. There's about a $700 decrease in our operating expenses. Those are the expenses that do have nothing to do with the support of our mission, but do have to do with providing branch meetings, newsletters, anything that the branch uses and is not part of our mission contributions. So we did decrease that budget. We did not change. What's in green is all of the contributions that we expect to make to local and to national. So that's the 19. 160 you keep hearing about. And that's the amount of money that shares is tasked to provide for next year. So we basically are raising for next year's budget. The difference is approximately $1,000 that will come out of our reserves. We want to draw down those reserves anyway. If we do not, and I say if because I really know we are going to, but if we should have a shortfall, we have enough reserves this year to make sure that the budget is met. We will not be able to do that every year, but we'll be okay. If you look at the bottom, you'll see that ending balance. That's the money that we will have in reserves in order to fund things before we raise any money. You'll notice that it's about the same amount. That's the amount of cushion that we need so that we can pay our bills before we get all our money in. Any questions, please let me know, ask them. You can use chat but it hasn't changed that much, except if you go back, Mary, scroll back up to the beginning. What you'll notice is you'll see dues, you'll see the postgraduate, and then you'll see this large shares and the contribution to national. That shares will be filled in as we get more used to the different events that we're going to be used for funding. But since we've never used these events before, like the walk and like the cookbook and things like that, we're going to just group it all in shares. And as we use the events, you'll see a better breakout so that you can see how much money we spent and how much money we got in. If there are any questions?
I think we're ready to hear a motion from the floor to move to pass this budget. We will need a motion and a second. And once we do that, Carol Sturgis will put up a poll. So is there a motion from the floor, please?
I move that we accept the budget. This is Barbara Lodi.
Is there a second?
I seconded. Pat Chupkowski.
Thank you. All right, now we are ready for the poll. Carol will tee up a poll, and it'll be a kind of a thumbs up and a thumbs down, or abstention, of course.
Oh,
So we've got a pretty good response. 20 people, a lot of people are voting. This is so cool, Carol, that we're able to vote like this. I suppose we can give it to 45 seconds. We're at 33 seconds right now. And we have 51 people that have signed on for tonight's meeting. That is awesome.
Yes,
By the
it's
way,
a secret.
it's an anonymous voting. There's
Yeah.
no way to tie back names and the way it should be.
Do you see the results, Mary?
Yes.
So
that's
did we
good, 'cause
see?
I can't.
Okay. Can someone share the results? Because it's not on my screen either.
Yeah, so it looks like 100% of members approved the 2021-22 budget.
And I would say
Excellent.
37 members voted.
Excellent. Thank you very much, ladies. And thank you, Kathy Schultz, for your stewardship and for your certainly the handling of our funds for AAUW. Really appreciate that. Okay, moving forward on our second business item tonight, it's with a great deal of pleasure that I introduce our one and only reliable nominations chair, Mary Mendham. She will talk about the slate of candidates, and then we will also have a motion to approve and then a poll to follow. Mary?
As the nominating committee chairperson, it is my duty to conduct the election of officers. Tonight, we will be electing them, And then in May, we will install the officers and they will officially take office on July 1. Mary, you can put up the slate of officers on the screen if you'd like, and I will read their names. Here are the names of the nominees. Co-president, Mary Meserly. Now, does she have the slide up?
No,
No,
it is
there-
not cooperating
no.
with me again. Let's see.
Okay, I'll keep reading.
Yeah, keep going.
Vice President of Membership, Linda Palula. Secretary, Victoria Vestala, and Treasurer, Kathy Schultz. At this time, I will entertain other nominations from the floor. Remember to nominate anyone not present. She must have given prior consent. Use the chat room for any nominations, please. Are there any nominations for the office of co-president? Are there any nominations for the office of co-president? Hearing and seeing none, I declare nominations for co-president closed at this time. Are there any nominations for the office of vice president of membership? Again, use the chat room. Are there any nominations for the office of vice president of membership? Hearing none or seeing none, I declare nominations for vice president of membership closed. Are there any nominations for the office of secretary? Are there any nominations for the office of secretary? Hearing and seeing none, I declare nominations for secretary closed. Are there any nominations for the office of treasurer? Are there any nominations for the office of treasurer? Hearing or seeing none, I declare nominations for treasurer are closed. Because there are no other nominations for these positions, I request that a motion be made to cast a unanimous vote for the named officers. Please use the chat room for your motion. So I need a first and a second. Would someone?
Could someone verbally make that as a motion and we'll know who you are?
I so move that we accept the nominations as named. This is Barbara Lodi.
Thank you, Barbara. Is there a second?
I second it, Vicky Philandrinos.
Thank you.
Excellent.
We are putting the poll up on the screen where you can now vote for the motion, yes or no, as we have mentioned. And what are the results? Wonderful. So the motion has passed 100%, which is fabulous, for the 2021-2022 new officers. Congratulations. You will be the new officer as of July 1, 2021. Thank you.
Mary, thank you so much for your leadership, and thank you, membership, for your confidence in myself in continuing to co-lead this organization. So now we have two announcements before we proceed forward with our featured speaker. Our first announcement is from our well-read and scholarly Carol McFarland for a West Suburban Reads update.
Greetings, everyone. I'm here to invite you to join other members in a Zoom presentation of a pre-recorded interview with Isabel Wilkerson as she discusses her book, Cast, The Origin of Our Discontents. Historian John Meacham will conduct this interview, and branch members will be able to participate in a discussion after the interview. This special Out and About Inside event is the culmination of this year's West Suburban Reads program. You do not need to have read the book, Small Great Things by Jodi Picoult, to participate in the discussion. A punchbowl invitation sharing this same information, including an RSVP, has been sent to all members. The link to this Zoom presentation will be forwarded to you just before the event occurs. The date is April 28th at 6:30 p.m. If you have any questions, or if for some reason you did not receive an invitation, please give me a call. See you there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. I know the first Zoom meeting with Small Great Things was a very, very well attended meeting, and I was able to participate in that. So thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Our second announcement is from Carol Davian, our nature specialist, and she's going to tell us a little bit about our upcoming May 22nd spring walk at Foxbrook. Carol?
Hi. Okay, we hope that you sign up for the walk on May 27th or 22nd. And there will be an article and a registration form in the postgraduate. There also will be one soon on the website also. So we were there yesterday, and it's really a nice park and facility. We also have the shelter area, so we are undercover. There are picnic tables, so you can even bring games and things to participate in after the walk. There's also a plant sale, so that was in the postgraduate and will be again. So get that order in to Linda Babcock. And again, that's from Shady Lane. So 25% of those proceeds will come back to us for scholarships. Trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, there also will be lunch, a very simple lunch, probably subs that we will have for you after the walk also. We'll have some coffee. We found out yesterday we can make coffee in the clubhouse. Bathrooms are right there. So we hope you sign up for this. It is a fundraiser. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carol. Well, there's certainly a lot to look forward to in the latter part of April and May. I've been to Foxbrook several times, and it's a lovely, lovely park. I think I'm going to make sure that my Fitbit is charged for that. Okay, so moving on to tonight's featured speaker. First of all, I would like to say that our public policy is supporting tonight's featured speaker, supporting the efforts to involve racial, ethnic, and gender justice will work to eradicate intersectional bias as well. This includes creating a diverse culture of involvement, respect, inclusion, and connection where richness of ideas, backgrounds, perspectives is fully appreciated and utilized. Our public policy statement supporting tonight's speaker. And now I would like to ask our very resourceful and delightful Pat Ryerson to introduce tonight's speaker. Pat?
Good evening, all. I would like to say hi. It was great to see everybody's faces and to see the new baby. My gracious, a new member coming. And maybe we should look into what can we do membership-wise for new children born, both males and females. I want to ask you all tonight to become an important part of courageous reflection and a candid conversation on racism. Those are deep words and simple words all at the same time. And again, I ask yourself to have this courageous self-reflection. What will you learn about yourself tonight? If you took the Harvard study, it was interesting to get the results and see where I thought I was as compared to where I actually came out. We often hear family and friends say, oh, I don't see color. Yeah, I mean, I'm not prejudiced. I simply don't see color. But I ask you to hear the words of Naraya Waheed, who is a Black poetess. Never trust anyone who says they do not see color. This means to them, you are invisible. Our guide tonight in exploring these words is Ginny Finn, President, CEO of the YWCA of Southeastern Wisconsin. As an attorney, she has practiced in the area of healthcare and and for tax-exempt organizational law. Ginny's a graduate of Coe College, Purdue University, and our own University of Wisconsin Law School. Like myself, she has lived both in Wisconsin and California. She grew up in a family of 7 children, and she was the oldest. Herself, then 5 boys, and then 16 years later, she finally had a sister born. And a life fun event that I think was just fun is that her first on stage speaking, and Ginny is a wonderful speaker, her first on stage performance was as Cindy Lou Woo in The Grinch Stole Christmas. Welcome, Ginny.
Thank you. I was wondering, Pat asked me for personal tidbits and I was not sure what she was going to do with them. So thank you for not choosing the more embarrassing ones.
Ginny, may I, and I apologize, may I just quickly insert that we will be taking questions for Ginny this evening, and you can utilize the chat room. So we will certainly not interrupt the flow of your presentation, but members can go to the chat and just simply indicate question, and that will designate that at the end of your presentation that Lisa will be tracking our questions, and then we will field back to you the questions. I so apologize for the interruption, but I just wanted to remind our members that they can ask you questions in the chat feature. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and certainly no need to apologize. In fact, I am a little intimidated by not only who you are as a group, but that one keeps referring to this as a presentation. So I don't have any dance moves, I assure you, and that's a good thing. I would like to start by thanking Pat for inviting me to have conversation with you. And that really is what I'm anticipating this evening, is conversation. Those of us who work at YWCA often join groups who are interested in these topics specifically for conversation, if for no other reason, because we believe that that's the beginning of reflection and understanding. And as Pat referenced, the topics that you've chosen for tonight are both deep and yet at the same time seem obvious at the surface. And so it's certainly not my presumption that in the up to 55 minutes that we have together, that we're going to solve everything and all agree and change the world tomorrow. But I do believe that conversation and respectful listening and reflection are ongoing processes, and that they are part of us figuring out the national experience that we are now all having. I don't know if I'm allowed to share my screen. I'm going to give it a shot. It's the green arrow seems like it's going to let me do it.
Yeah, you should be able to, Ginny.
Okay, so let's see. Screen share. And the question is, did you all get a screen?
Yes.
Yay, excellent.
Yes.
So although I said conversation, I am going to be presumptuous and take a little time to just do a quick commercial about YWCA Southeast Wisconsin, which I also think would provide some context for the work that we do and the conversation that we're going to have. So obviously here's just a title slide. This is not a picture of me, but this is my name down here. There we are. And then a little bit about YWCA. Many of you may be familiar with this organization already. We are actually, as an international organization, over 170 years old. And actually, something I did not know, YWCA as well as YMCA were both actually started in London. So they're not originally from the United States, although within 3 years of being founded in London, the first YWCA was established in the United States. Here in Wisconsin, this particular affiliate was established 128 years ago and has been growing ever since. And in 2014, we evolved from the YWCA of Greater Milwaukee to YWCA of Southeast Wisconsin at the request of our national office. The bulk of our programming is in Racine and Milwaukee, counties. However, our service area is officially Kenosha, Racine, Milwaukee, Waukesha, and Ozaki counties. And now that many services are virtual, that may actually become more of a reality than it has been historically. All YWCAs are chartered to serve their own communities and the specific needs, but through a common lens. We have one mission: to eliminate racism and empower women. And we want to do that through a dedication to promoting peace, justice, and freedom for all. And that last word, I think, is going to be the focus for this evening. We do have 3 lenses that we use: racial justice, economic empowerment, and health and safety. But those lenses will be different every place you go. So for example, there are quite a few YWCAs whose health and safety bucket is satisfied by providing domestic violence services. Here in Southeast Wisconsin, this is how the pillars work for us. Health and safety for us is not a direct service provision, but rather the lens through which we assess our programming on an ongoing basis. We use a social determinants of health lens, and I would expect that all of you are probably familiar with that term, but just in case, it is all the things other than your physical condition that contribute to your health. Do you have a roof over your head? Do you have access to nutritional food? Do you have access and understand the importance of mental health? Do you have a regular income? Those are all social determinants of health, and there are many more. Our particular lens then translates into racial justice work, and we are also expanding that to include gender equity. One of the things we've been honest about with ourselves over the last year is that we don't do the W in YWCA particularly well when it comes to our systems work. We have primarily focused on racial justice, and we are going to be doing a better job. We started this reexamination in 2019. We're going to be doing a better job of focusing on the intersection of gender equity and racial justice. Our economic empowerment services are probably most well known because those are the services that are provided to individuals. And it's really about helping them build a better future for themselves and their family, which will also contribute to a thriving region. So this is where we run the largest community-based adult education program in the state of Wisconsin. And in fact, we had a 27% increase in high school graduations by adults during the COVID pandemic. So virtual actually allowed us to expand our services. We also provide extensive financial literacy and coaching. And we also provide a full menu of job readiness services, as well as access to interviews and employers, etc. In particular, with respect to the racial justice work, which really filters into our conversation this evening, as you might imagine, after the murder of George Floyd, everything exploded for us. So we lived in a world like everybody else that was just barely adjusting to COVID-19 and the economic upheaval that it was creating, making sure that we were taking care of our own staff and the people that turned to us for help. We are an essential service, so we were never closed, and in fact expanded services to make sure people had access to food and practical things like diapers and feminine products. But within days of Mr. Floyd's murder, the demand for our racial justice services just simply exploded. The slide says doubled, but there's just no way to even quantify what happened. The good news is that although it took us some work and some dancing, we were able to be responsive in a focused way. Our public classes and workshops, we more than doubled the offerings starting in July of 20 and continuing to this day. And as you can see on the slide, I won't read it to you, there is a variety of different organizations and employers that turn to us for racial justice consulting. And what that means is we work with them internally to help them examine their policies and practices, and also provide actual training and coaching, often to their leadership teams, but in some cases to their entire organization. So for example, in 2018 through the middle of 2020, we provided racial justice training to the entirety of the Milwaukee County workforce, from the janitors and the bus drivers to then County Executive Chris Abele. and that the ripple effect of that work continues under the current county executive, who has continued specific work in the pocket of racial justice, racism as a public health crisis. This all builds on our future. We want a Southeast Wisconsin, as you can read here, that is thriving and inclusive. We understand that to be defined by racial and gender equity, and we believe that is the foundation for a healthy community. And the reason that wraps around to the beginning of the vision is that we don't believe communities can thrive unless they are healthy. So for tonight's conversation, Pat and I spent time going back and forth these last few months, so I do want to give her credit for really giving me guidance and feedback as to what might be useful for you all. And so on the one hand, it may sound simple, but these are actually pretty hefty goals for one starter conversation. We'd like to have common language so that conversation and reflection can continue. Have some discussion about clarifying concepts, including acknowledging the fact that concepts in the racial justice realm are continually evolving, and not everyone actually agrees on what those concepts are. I suppose in some ways that's not different than any other kind of sociology or social justice movement. I want to talk a little about with you and explore with you how to create brave spaces instead of safe spaces. And I'll explain why I mean that. And then as we close, what can our conversation tonight do to build understanding and support further learning beyond this evening? Because as has already been acknowledged, this is not just a one-night conversation. So to that end, I believe that there was a handout that was distributed electronically. I hope that I'm correct on that. That had the presentation description, but also had some definitions and whatnot. So I hope folks were able to check those out, but I'm not going to assume that anybody's memorized them, and they'll be the bulk of the start of this presentation, if you will. All of us come to different conversations, in particularly difficult conversations, using language that we often believe we're using the same words and mean the same thing. And turns out when we realize we disagree with each other or we end up having actual arguments, part of the reason is we realize we have had a failure to communicate, as the expression goes. And it's not necessarily for any reason more complicated than I say tomato and you say tomato. So that's why, aside from that as a communication basis, but also because I'm a born lawyer, I like definitions. In fact, I grew up in a household where as soon as you knew your ABCs, if you asked mom or dad, or in some cases grandma or grandpa, what a word meant, you weren't told. You were marched over to the dictionary that sat on a stand. And my grandfather gets the particular credit for that. So I think a couple of the things that we should make sure that at least for tonight, these are the definitions of these words. There's no requirement. This isn't an indoctrination session. So if you don't agree with these definitions, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the definitions we're using for this evening so that we can have clarity when we have conversation. The first one is simply access. And for your reference, most of these definitions can be found not only on our website, but also are common definitions that are found at the Smithsonian Institute's Museum of African American History and Culture. So I haven't made up these definitions, I guess is what I'm telling you. Access for tonight should be understood as the ability, right, or permission to approach, enter, speak, or use something in relationship to race. This means access to racial identity gives some people, but not everybody, a position of authority, higher education, financial resources, or perhaps even social standing. And we'll also talk openly, even though we are, as far as I can tell from pictures, a predominantly, if not universal, white audience. I will acknowledge what I have learned from my colleagues of color about how those things actually aren't limited only to a white community. And I think some of those examples would be particularly useful for those of you who choose to go to the webinar that was mentioned that will involve a discussion of Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, which, by the way, I think it's brilliant. It's a fabulous book. I highly recommend it. Discrimination is another important definition. For our purposes tonight, it means the denial of justice and fair treatment for a person or a group based on a social identity. And I think that's an important definition because, of course, literally, discrimination simply means to make a distinction. It doesn't have to have a negative connotation. But for tonight, that is the connotation that we will be understanding. Power is a particularly important word because it actually influences a lot of other definitions. Power for tonight is the ability to name, define, or decide, the ability to change or set a rule, standard, or policy. And in the context of a race issue, it's important that as we reflect and converse tonight, we think about who has power in a given situation, whether it's personal power, institutional power, or maybe structural power. And by that, I mean maybe the inherent assumptions we make in our social structures. Similarly, prejudice can be a benign word, but in this case, we do mean it for this evening's conversation to have a negative preconceived notion. Here's a tricky word, and there is a lot of pushback when conversation about race involves this word, and it's the word privilege. And I'm actually fascinated by the pushback. If you've ever heard the expression white privilege, often people will say, I don't have any privilege. I didn't grow up with advantages. And that may be true because we all have different privileges. Some of us have none. Most of us have some, and they vary depending on who we are and our life circumstances. So for example, my privileges, when I'm asked to name them, include some really basic things. I had the privilege of being born within a marriage between two people who actually loved each other. And that really affected the way I grew up. I was born into a family that had the privilege of valuing higher education, two parents that had higher education, but also appreciated the absence of higher education because they did not come from families where everybody had one. I did not have the privilege of wealth. And in fact, due to circumstances that affected my parents' life, including dramatic health situations, I didn't even realize till I was an adult that by the time I was in high school, I actually lived in what would have been considered an impoverished family. I also have privileges that I only recognize now as an adult. I grew up in Milwaukee, in the city. I grew up on the west side of Milwaukee, in Washington, the Washington Park neighborhood. Not Washington Heights, not the right side of Washington Park, the wrong side of Washington Park. Although at my age, it wasn't yet the wrong side. But what I experienced firsthand, but had no language for as a child or as a teenager, was white flight. When I finally learned about it as an adult and read about it, I didn't have to be convinced that it was real because 2 summers in a row, almost every dinner time was interrupted by someone knocking on our front door, trying to convince my parents to sell the house because Black people were moving in and our property values were going to go down. My parents actually ended up being volunteers and were those white couples that ended up looking at houses and apartments and then be followed by Black couples during the fair housing days. But I tell you that in particular because I actually now as an adult look at that as a privilege of sorts, because I lived in a neighborhood that was redlined and is actually the focus of the consent decree that was entered into by American Family Insurance, the Wisconsin Bankers Association, and the Wisconsin Realtors Association, because they consented to fixing the damage caused by their conspiracy to redline certain neighborhoods in Milwaukee. My parents' home became dilapidated because they couldn't get a loan to fix the roof. So I do, in an odd way, consider that a privilege. And why does the definition of privilege matter? Oh, apparently I'm supposed to admit somebody. Is that right?
We'll take care of that, Jenny.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Ignore those. Ignore those. We'll get them for you.
Okay. A privilege for the purpose of tonight, and I hope those examples have illustrated, is a benefit that's received by a person or of a group that is beyond the advantages of others, or perhaps even most. There's actually an activist named Peggy McIntosh who defines white privilege specifically as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, and that I'm meant to be oblivious to this privilege. So I certainly grew up of a generation that was aware that women weren't allowed to do certain things. My mother was actually very active and was part of founding the first NOW chapter here in Milwaukee. So I grew up in a family that talked about sexism. But so I was aware of it, if nothing else, because I was indoctrinated about those concepts at the dinner table. But I wasn't aware of the privilege of being white until probably high school. I went to a high school that happened to be racially integrated and is even more so now. And therefore I had friends from all kinds of backgrounds. And one day, a bunch of us got on the bus back in the days when teenagers did that and did insist on having mom and dad's car. So now you know how old I am. And we went down to the south side because JH Collectibles was having a sale and we wanted to buy fun clothes for really cheap. We weren't very smart. We took the wrong bus and ended up in a neighborhood that was fairly industrialized and didn't usually have teenage girls running around in it unescorted. It happened that I was bitten by a dog. We got ourselves home. My dad called the cops to report the dog bite and then was going to take me to the doctor. And the police officer lectured me because I, as a white girl, had no, and he said this literally, had no business being in that neighborhood. I never would have called it white privilege, but I never understood. Now when the word came up, I understood the concept that I'm not conscious of being white in a world where that's quote unquote normal. That does not mean that any of us who are white haven't worked for everything we've gotten and have had and not had any necessary privilege, any privileges necessarily. But it does mean we have, for this concept, been oblivious to the fact that being white meant that we didn't have to deal with the issues of not being white. Of course, we now live in a nation and a community that is talking about that reality much more candidly. The other two definitions before we have more less me talking and more conversation I'd like to share is really about what is racism. Racism is not individual prejudice against someone because of their race. Racism, like all isms, is a system, whether it's something you like or don't like. So it could be feminism, it could be socialism, capitalism, pick your ism. By virtue of the structure of the word, it's talking about a system. And racism is, for the purposes of this conversation, a race-based prejudice. So remember here, prejudice means a negative connotation, plus skin color privilege. So we just talked about privilege, plus the actual power to exercise discrimination. And that power conversation, I think, is part of what will be part of our nuances this evening. And then the other definition I think is important is implicit bias. And I do hope that some of you had the opportunity to go online and take the implicit bias test that Pat mentioned and that was in the handout. If you haven't, I certainly encourage you to do so. It's really fascinating. It's all based on neurological studies, and it's not at all specific to race or ethnic background. You can test implicit bias on anything. And implicit bias simply refers to attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding of things, affect our decisions, but do so in an unconscious manner. And so an example I often give so that folks understand that implicit bias isn't per se bad or good is we are encultured from very young ages to engage in certain behavior and make certain distinctions. And that's how they become implicit. They are just imprinted in our neurology. An example would be those of us who grew up here in the United States. When our parents teach us to safely cross the street, we are taught to look left first and then right, because cars coming on the right, driving in the right lane, are going to hit us from the left first. So you look automatically to where that danger is. Those who grow up in England or other places where they drive on the other side of road have parents that teach them the opposite. And now I, as an adult who grew up here, have an implicit bias, a muscle memory, if you will, that looks left before I cross the street. So an implicit bias doesn't have to be created out of any malice or even have any malice, but we are unaware of it. I'm not aware that I'm looking left. I just do it naturally. And I think that when that was once explained to me, so many light bulbs went out for me. But also there is a speaker, a white man, who has worked for 2 decades in racial justice, the racial justice field. His name is Tim Wise. And I've heard him speak a couple of times, but most recently, just before COVID, I heard him speak at Carthage College. And he told a story about his grandmother, which was a really, it was a really good illustration of implicit bias and how ingrained and unconscious these are. His grandmother, as he acknowledged, grew up in a very prejudiced family, pretty much prejudiced against any human being other than their particular background. But she happened to fall in love with, as a young woman, and choose to marry a Jew. This was completely unacceptable to her family, and she was completely disowned. And she had no further contact with her birth family of any significance for the rest of her adult life. And she and her husband brought up their children, one of whom was the parent of the speaker, very differently. And the speaker had nothing but loving things to say about his grandmother, and said that he had never witnessed anything that would have taught him prejudice as far as he could tell. He never heard a vulgar or derogatory word against another section of society out of her mouth, and that she had very much been involved in making sure that people who were marginalized had access to all kinds of things that would improve their lives. She then, in her later years, became an Alzheimer's patient. And by the time she was quite advanced and in a facility and really, didn't know who she was anymore, etc., when she would get frustrated, she would become quite angry, as is not uncommon with Alzheimer's patients. And most of her caregivers were African-American women. And every vulgar word about African-American people came out of her mouth. And what Tim came to understand, especially as he consulted her doctors, was explain that the neurological pathways that we have as children are when things are truly imprinted on us, things we're not even aware of. And they are the most difficult things to unlearn. And yet it's not impossible to unlearn them, but it does take reflection and it does take candor. So those are most of the common language I wanted to share with you. But I in particular thought that we might want to explore white privilege a little bit as a concept. There's a lot of pushback about this concept, including within communities of color. There is a book that was provided in the handout that was shared called White Fragility by an author and academic named Robin DiAngelo. And it's a very interesting thing that's happened. This book came out a number of years ago and was considered groundbreaking in terms of introducing the concept of white fragility. And quite frankly, I think it's a very difficult book for most white people to read. It certainly was for me, because it really challenges concepts that I had taken for granted my whole life. And I'm not even saying I agree with everything she says, but it did really make me think in ways that I had not done before when I first read it. And then also when I heard her speak. I did not work here at the time, but she was actually a speaker at a YWCA event a number of years ago. However, now that we are living in a day and age where speaking about right, fragility, and racial justice is a much more common activity, she has received a lot of criticism, in particular from communities of color, about making money and making presentations about white fragility and centering herself and her journey to understanding these concepts, rather than giving the stage over to people of color. And people of color from all walks of life have sometimes defended her and sometimes not. But what is interesting is I have not ever seen or witnessed a recorded conversation. You know, we can all go online and watch webinars now, where these things were hostile. Rather, I have witnessed individuals giving grace to each other and recognizing that as we figure these things out, we are allowed to disagree. But what we are not, allowed's not the right word. What is unproductive is to get angry and try and quiet other people and not listen, even though it's difficult. Because we can't learn new things if we're not willing to listen to difficult things. It's not unlike things that happened in terms of sexism as a system. I'm sure we can all remember a time when women who were subject to domestic violence were told to just be quiet and put up with it, that they were rocking the boat. And it was only really by women, mostly. I mean, there are men who are subject to domestic violence, but it was only by women who were willing to stand up and say, no, I am going to rock the boat, and we are going to talk about this. And especially women who were from nice families, who weren't expected to air family dirty laundry in public. And now, decades later, even though we still have much work to do in the domestic violence field, it is not dismissed as something that we shouldn't be talk about. And we need to find the muscle, the emotional muscle, and the emotional bravery to do the same thing when it comes to racism. At least in my opinion, we need to do that work. And the reason for that is we often hear the expression, especially on college campuses, about having a safe space. And certainly I do want to acknowledge that there is mental and emotional distress connected to discussing difficult issues, but especially those of us who are adults, especially by the time you're my age, if we only want to talk about things that are comfortable and the things that make us feel safe, how are we ever going to change things in a constructive way if we're not willing to talk about things that do need to change? And including in those conversations, push back if we think a concept or a definition is unfair. We do not have to agree, but I think if we really want to build a civil society where everyone is welcome, not just feels welcome, but is actually welcome and included, we have to be willing to examine our understanding of community and our understanding of our world. And one of the reasons I say that, and one of the places I learned to reflect on that, was actually a YWCA course that we still offer, but I took it years before I ever worked here. It's called Unlearning Racism: Tools for Action. And it is a 6-part course that starts with teaching history, really. History that many of us probably didn't get in high school, although maybe younger members of the branch have. Certainly, I was taught history at a time where my knowledge in history class of the Civil War was basically, the Southerners wanted to keep slaves, the Northerners didn't. They argued about it. A lot of people died, and even the president was assassinated, but we created amendments and got rid of slavery. And until Until Brown versus Board of Education, we had no problem. I never learned anything about Jim Crow. I never knew anything about lynching until I was in college. So I didn't know all kinds of things that are also part of US history that have shaped the experience of my fellow citizens whose skin color happens to be different than mine. Certainly they knew that history. I can give you also an example of my adult life in law school. I went to law school to study law and health policy, but I went as an older student. I was in my mid-30s when I went. And so one of my health policy classes, I learned about something called the Tuskegee experiments, something I had never known about. And for those of you who might not be familiar, these were experiments that were done, including the withholding of treatment to African-American men who were diagnosed with syphilis. And even though we had discovered appropriate treatment through antibiotics for syphilis, in order to study the natural progression of the disease, for decades, African-American men in this study who were being told that they were being given treatment were denied it. And many of them died and or were disfigured because the disease was allowed to advance. Fast forward after I'm no longer practicing law, but I'm now a guest lecturer in a health law class that is required at UWM of undergraduate nursing and social work students. I start the session that I teach, which is on ethical decision-making and advanced directives, by asking the assembled class, who has ever heard of the Tuskegee experiments? I taught that module for 12 years. And this is a required class, the smallest of which was about 50 students, and the largest of which one year was over 70 students. In that entire time, I never had one white student, with the exception of 2 older white students who were former Army medics, who had ever heard of Tuskegee. I never had a Black student who not only didn't know about it, but knew all about it and had learned about it at the kitchen table. So although there are many reasons that academics will tell us that people of color, in particular Black citizens in this country, distrust the healthcare establishment, understanding that they were experimented on in modern day. This wasn't back when people were slaves. There was plenty of that going on. This was in modern day. That creates distrust. That tells you you are less than. And not even knowing the fullness of our history is a privilege. Another example I can give you, and then I really would like to stop talking and open actual conversation because you've been so gracious to allow me to keep going. Even in my book club, I inadvertently learned things I did not know. I joined a book club in middle of 2019, thank heavens, because it became my entire social life once we had to stay safe at home orders in 2020. One of the things I loved about this book club is it's not one of those book clubs, and you'll forgive me, I'm about to reveal my personality. Some book clubs, people collect titles and vote and come to a consensus about what they're going to read for a year. That's not me. I really want to read things that I might not otherwise pick up. So this book club is one of those things where everybody gets their month assigned, and come hell or high water, you're going to read what Mary picked for that book club that month. So it happened that a number of the members of the book club actually like books that are set in World War II. And we had read a couple in a row, very different books, but all set in that time frame. So the woman whose turn it was said, well, you know, we spent a lot of time in World War II, so I thought we'd come back to the United States for a while, because those are often books that were based in Europe or Japan. And I thought it would be fun to read a biography. We hadn't done that in a while. So she picked the biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder. And most of us are Midwesterners, so this, and of a certain age. So this was actually something we were all excited about because most of us had grown up reading the Little House books. And some of us had even spent our teenage years watching Little House on the Prairie. And it turned out to be a fascinating, very well researched book that didn't talk just about the author's life and how that manifests in the stories that she read, but it alternated chapters telling you what was going on historically in the time period of the books, and then also in the time period that the author became an author, because she didn't start writing those books until she was in her 60s. But one of the things I learned in that process was the homesteading her family kept doing. If any of you read the books, you remember they started in Wisconsin, and then they moved to Minnesota, and then they moved to Kansas, and then they went back to Dakotas, etc. It was all part of what white settlers were being encouraged to do by laws that were being passed by the United States government to encourage settling and therefore relocating the American Indians that already lived there. I never learned in a lot of detail. I mean, I remembered vaguely that history, but the president who promoted those acts that allowed that homesteading is a president that we hold up because he gave us the Emancipation Proclamation. But he also is the president most responsible for removing Indians from Indian land in those days. And that's Abraham Lincoln. And as I've learned more about the experience of indigenous communities and how that life experience affected their culture, I had to think, wow, that's another piece of white privilege. I don't fully understand the robust history of this nation the way some of my friends and neighbors of color do. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the noble things that have been accomplished in our history. But I do think if we understood the fullness of our history, we might be better prepared to have honest conversations now about what's happening in our nation with respect to racial justice. So I hope that those perspectives, both from professional definitions and examples from my personal life, are a good starting point for us to have conversation and to share your own reflections. Because again, tonight, as I understand it, is about creating the soup for reflection and continued conversation, not to solve a bunch of problems. So I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. I will provide the disclaimer that you are stuck with me, the human being, answering those questions. There is no particular academic credential behind my answers, and they represent my understanding of racial justice work today on April 14th, and that I'm learning new things every day. Many times those new things also change my mind, or at least cause me to step back and be willing to reflect further. And it also doesn't have to be a conversation that's about Q&A. I'm sure that many of you know each other and have lively conversations. And if there are perspectives and experiences that you would like to share that you think will help this conversation, I hope you will choose to do so. So I thank you for your attention and your time. And I'm pretty much, I think, done.
Well,
Ginny,
thank you,
so
Ginny,
much.
for
Thank you
sharing your.
Thank you for those definitions, the privilege, the power, the discrimination. And I think it's very appropriate as we move forward into this conversation to have the continuity and the consistency of those definitions too. And you know, and I was really struck by the brave spaces versus the safe spaces. And so you really gave a lot to ponder, a lot to think about, a lot to reflect on. One of our members has been tracking the questions, so we will start to field some of the questions. If someone has perhaps a desire to share more expansively in terms of a story or an illustration, we can certainly unmute you and you may do that. Otherwise, we'll continue to field the questions in the chat feature of just simply writing your questions, and Lisa would be happy to relay those to Ginny. But thank you so much for your courage. Thank you for being present, and thank you for all of our members to be here too. These are very difficult and sometimes can be painful conversations as we reflect and we have our own ownership and accountability along the lines of white privilege. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Lisa as we have some questions coming in.
Before Lisa comes up, Ginny, do you mind unsharing your
Oh, I'm
screen?
so sorry. I am
That's
more
okay.
than happy to do that. Let's stop the share.
Thank you, Carol.
The little red button is very small.
Yes, it is.
Sorry about that. I was so engrossed in the commentary, I forgot about that.
Now we can see you.
Lucky you. And you can see my messy office.
So thank you so much, Ginny. One of our first questions is about you had mentioned how to create brave spaces instead of safe spaces. Can you comment a little bit more on what that means?
Sure. I don't know if this has been your experience, but it is a common experience, and it has certainly been my experience. And I'm speaking as a white woman. I'm in mixed company, so that's not just a white audience. And I want to have a serious conversation, but I'm so afraid of saying something wrong or offensive that I actually don't choose to have a conversation. And I think that's a lost opportunity. I mean, obviously, and this isn't true just about race, it's about anything that might be a challenging conversation. I think obviously you have to read the room and know the people that you're with. And certainly if you're going to choose to enter into conversation, one that somebody else started or one that you want to start, acknowledging up front that you're a fallible human being and that you appreciate the grace of others if you stick your foot in your mouth. But I can give you an example of a recent, I belong to a conversation circle, I don't know, for lack of a better term, in which one of the women wanted to explore where the stereotype of the angry Black woman came from. That was she just wanted help understanding what was the root of that stereotype. She herself found it an offensive and unhelpful stereotype. However, the way she expressed her question, I will just simply say at minimum was clumsy. And yet, because she was in a space, she said, she started with, I'm going to say this in a way that I know is probably not going to be polished. And if you didn't trust my intentions, you would take offense at. And I hope you'll just give me grace. So she basically took a risk to talk about something problematic. She acknowledged that it was problematic, and she chose to risk something herself. And that created a brave space. And the conversation continued immediately by the women of color acknowledging first that she took a risk. And then we actually end up having a conversation in which I learned a lot. And believe it or not, I said nothing. I know those of you who have just listened to me a half hour can't believe I said nothing, but I listened and I learned. And so that's when I say brave. If we condition our willingness to have these conversations on, I won't be offended, or nobody's going to call me out for using unkind words or stereotypical words, or if I'm going to say something kind of like the introduction Pat provided, I don't see color. If you say that and you really mean it, and somebody comes back and says, well, here's why not seeing color actually isn't a healthy thing, or is a potentially offensive thing. And if somebody says that to me and then I get all huffy and I don't want to talk anymore, it's because I've been unwilling to have a brave conversation. I only wanted to have a conversation that was safe, a conversation that rewarded me for being willing to talk about something touchy. So that's the distinction.
Okay, that helps a lot. Another question we had was beyond self-awareness and calling out racism, what specific actions can a white person take to help eliminate racism? It just feels like such a big hill to climb.
It is. It is. So it's so interesting because how do you even say it? So a number of years ago, I was at a Milwaukee Film Festival movie that happened to be one of the movies that was through the Black Lens series. And one of the people in the audience stood up and said, this is thank you for this movie. It was wonderfully done. This has to change. What can I do in the next 6 months to change this? And in my heart, I kept thinking, we are all living with hundreds of years of socialization. It's wonderful that we want to be part of changing it, but we shouldn't set ourselves up for the impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So practical tools. One, I would suggest to understand that education and learning about this is an ongoing process, and it includes things you guys are already doing. You've already been invited to a book presentation. I understand you've read a different book called Small Great Things, or a number of you chose to. So certainly reading is always helpful, especially if what you're trying to do is build your own understanding and that the way you learn is reading. Some people prefer to watch movies, or we certainly have a generation that's accustomed to conversation in public via Twitter and other social media tools. And actually on our website, we have different tools, and in the handout that was provided, there are links to some of those tools. Another practical thing you can do is actually probably one of the harder things, because it's personal. We all have Uncle Bob, who says things we don't agree with, sometimes at Thanksgiving or sometimes just at finding the bravery to tell Uncle Bob to stop. That's a first step. It's not about calling him out and telling him he's an evil, horrible person, nor is it necessarily trying to, especially in one conversation, change his mind and his behavior. But it is about being brave enough to say, Uncle Bob, at my dinner table, those words will not be used, and they will not be used in front of my children. If you want to have an adult conversation about that, Uncle Bob, I'm happy to do that anytime you want. But right now, in front of my children, you simply have to modify your behavior in order to be welcome at my dinner table. That's actually, for many of us, harder than to put a sign on our lawn or write a check to a charity that's, working in this space, because it's a personal relationship. But at some point, if we aren't willing in our own families or circles of influence to say, this isn't right, then that's a real problem. And for all we know, there's somebody else at that table who just doesn't have the bravery to do the same thing. So creating a brave space is about taking risks, but taking that risk at your own dining room table. There are some practical things. If you want to learn with other people, I can do a commercial. We offer public courses, and certainly those are available on our website. You can read about them. There are conversations on race is not as deep a dive as on learning racism. It's really about building conversational chops. And I think it's 5 sessions, and they're only 2 hours, and they're all by Zoom right now, obviously. And they're actually fascinating places to learn because people from all walks of life come. I mean, we have people who are retired teachers, people who are working, cops, students. It's amazing. A lot of librarians. It's very interesting. And so for example, when I took on Learning Racism Tools for Action, the last 2 sessions of that class are in fact what was asked. What are the tools I can do? And we're all given assignments to think of one thing we can do and that we will follow through on. And almost always the librarians, whether they're from a big library system or from the local elementary school, say, you know what, I'm responsible for making recommendations for what's on our bookshelves. And I will never forget that one of the women in my class was a librarian at an elementary school. And she said, I'm going to go back and look at the books that are on the shelves and make sure that there's representation so the little kids who aren't white can also see pictures of little kids who aren't white in the books that they pull off the shelves. So sometimes it may not even be something that sounds scary, but it really can change things. That being said, there are things you can do if you want more challenging things. One of the biggest things that's going on right now is voter suppression. I would encourage you, if you aren't already connected to League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, to check them out. And in particular in Wisconsin, we are probably the most effectively gerrymandered state in the country. There isn't a statewide election where we haven't had more votes on one side of the fence or the other in years. But we're so gerrymandered that we have a legislature that is controlled by one party. And that party is going to control the drawing of our maps. And Wisconsin used to be known for its fair map drawing, and the rules are about to be changed and controlled by one party. Now, certainly if you're in the party that's not in power, you can complain about it. But the reality is, no, in my opinion, no party should be controlling that. Doesn't matter which party it is, or if it doesn't even matter if there's only two parties. This is in essence our elected officials controlling who gets to vote for who. And we, I believe, as the electorate, should be making those decisions. So if you want something more complex, that's a real life thing that you can do, because that is step number one in voter suppression, is controlling who gets to vote for whom. I could give a whole bunch of other examples, but I hope that that gives you a menu of the different types of things.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I got a question that kind of goes in a little bit different direction, asking about racism against Asians. It's certainly something that's not new, but growing due to, the pandemic and the potential, origins of COVID.
Mm-hmm. So that is obviously a very timely question. And it's also a perfect example of how, when I said earlier that not everybody agrees on everything, Black communities of color have come out quite strongly for the most part in defense of our Asian American community members, given what's been going on during COVID. But there's also had to be an admission that there has been a tension between Black and brown communities and Asian communities because of this stereotype of the model minority that Asians are. And this is actually personal for me, even though I'm a white woman. I happen to have a sister-in-law who is Korean, and I have two nieces who are half European mix, because they're from my side, and Korean. And they initially grew up in Wauwatosa and went to a small school. And then when they got older, the family moved to Elm Grove. And because of their ages, one kid was enrolled in the middle school and one in a high school. And it was the first time for my nieces that they were in a large schools. They had been in a very small Catholic school where everybody knew everybody. I think the school might have had 100 kids. I mean, they were now in a different world. And they experienced what is often referred to as a microaggression, which is something that may not on its surface seem offensive, but is based in presumption. And so one of my nieces, and I don't know which one happened to which, each niece, when the school official fills out the profile, part of that profile is identifying the race and ethnic background of the student. In both the middle school situation and the high school situation, the school official did not ask either the student or my sister-in-law or my brother the racial identity of my nieces. And one of the school officials identified one of the girls as white and one of the girls as Asian American. Now I look at them and think, yeah, you're both clearly not all white, although one of you does have more Asian features than the other. And then as it turned out, as it's progressed, the one that was identified as Asian has been steered into science classes and math classes. So I give that benign or seemingly benign example, and now to go to the more serious situation. My friends, including my family members who are Asian, are fearful right now of being in public. This is probably a little too much information, but I'm just going to be completely transparent, as the current buzzword is. Last week, my niece's cousin, who was 19 years old, was shot and killed in a suburb of Chicago. And although it turns out that that was the result of a botched robbery, the initial part of the investigation include figuring out whether or not it was a hate crime because he was clearly of Asian descent. Wow. And that's how fearful everybody is right now. And it is an example, in my opinion, I am not speaking for YWCA, although I wouldn't be surprised if the board would support me, that our willingness to remain silent when racially derogatory language is used repeatedly, especially by our elected leaders, and we don't call them on it. And the reality is you can agree on a particular policy and still call out elected leader or any public figure on something you disagree.
Right.
But we as a nation, and quite frankly, we as white women who overwhelmingly voted for those that have been using racial epitaphs for the last 4 years, have got to do some reflecting. I mean, I actually am a fairly conservative fiscal policy person, but I have a duty to call that stuff out. And I can tell you from personal experience, it has created fear in the lives of people who are my family. This is not just something I'm reading about in the news.
Mm-hmm. So another.
Hard to be that transparent, but
yeah.
That's what the kids say out there. They all call it transparent. I just thought, you mean honest, but whatever.
Yeah. That's really tough to deal with. Another question that we had was, could you say a little bit about how you approach systemic racism in organizations that you consult with?
Certainly. So for the most part, that consulting starts with someone reaching out from an entity and saying, well, this is historical. Things have changed, gotten a little more nuanced in the last year. But historically, it's been, we had an incident. Can you come help us deal with it? And quite frankly, we often aren't allowed to talk about it, especially if it's a school system involving minor children, because they don't want to admit it. But I can give you an example of stuff that was quite public. So you might remember pre-COVID, there were quite public arguments within the Shorewood school system because the theater department was putting on To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah, I remember that.
And that actually was quite a nuanced situation, not just with the play, but how the students felt about it. The adults had different pockets and they handled it different ways, and the students were of a different opinion. The fact that we were helping facilitate some conversations behind the scenes was something we weren't allowed to talk about because they didn't want to admit there was a problem. And then once it hit the newspaper, that became a non-issue. More typically with businesses, and I don't mean not just for-profit businesses. So for example, we've done extensive work for years with the Medical College of Wisconsin. It is conversation at a leadership level about, we have a DEI program and it's just not making the changes we expected. Can you help us examine why and then make recommendations? So some of that can be pretty basic. Often that examination includes the fact that they've hired somebody to do DEI, but it's been undefined. That person has no authority to actually implement or even influence change, and is several levels below reporting to the CEO. So our first piece of advice is, if this function isn't accountable to the chief executive or someone who reports directly, you've got too many layers. Because it's about any kind of change. It's just considered scary because it's about racism, but any kind of organizational change requires that kind of authority and through line. So often our consulting is kind of like what we're doing now. The first step might be providing a workshop for different cohorts of team members, often starting within the HR department. And often it's not just about race. They may be bringing other subject matter experts in to talk about ableism, to talk about sexism, so that they understand that if they want to recruit a diverse workforce, they have to actually engage in recruitment practices that aren't identical to the ones that didn't get them a diverse workforce. I mean, I think we've all heard the joke that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and over. But one of the other things we do is we actually examine not just their policies, but we'll do an in-depth dive into their actual practices. So this often involves interviewing, in particular in the HR example, folks to find out, okay, your policy is X. Tell me how that manifests in your day-to-day work. And we often uncover the fact that the practices aren't in sync with the stated policy's objectives. And so then like any situation where policies are X and practices are Y, you then provide coaching that includes outside accountability, where we often come back on a monthly or quarterly basis to say, okay, how has the practice changed? What changes are you seeing? For the most part, we do not have clients that see significant change unless they really engage in this in at least a year or so. But for example, our work with the Medical College of Wisconsin has been through a social determinants of health lens, and I am grateful to them. Dr. Raymond, who became a well-known figure in partnership with the MMAC as the business community navigated the needs of COVID, I'm very grateful that he gave credit to not only his personal perspective, but the perspective of his leadership teams of understanding that COVID was affecting communities of color differently, that he gave credit to understanding that very early on, not by the data that we're collecting, but by the training and consulting we had been providing them. So that's like a bird's eye view of it. Certainly, if anybody would like to learn more about it, either for your own personal reference or because you would like to connect us with an organization that you think could benefit from our services, I'd be happy to hear from you.
So thank you. I actually work for the medical college. So
oh, you're kidding! Oh my gosh! Okay, that wasn't a planned plant, but
so it's kind of funny. Well, and it's funny because I also work for children's, and you know, both have diversity and inclusion programs, but they just kind of take different tactics with them.
Well, the truth is we're all learning. Our consulting and coaching is very different today than it was even years ago.
Yeah.
Because everybody is in a different mindset. And on the one hand, you have to accept where people are, but you also have to be willing to nudge a little and become a trusted partner if your goal is actual change.
Yeah. How do you deal with situations that sort of maybe reinforce stereotypes? Like a few that I've seen recently were we were just on spring break and there really weren't any incidents, but the one incident we did see was a Black couple arguing very loudly in a parking lot, like to the point where we're like, well, is something going to happen? Do we need to call, the police or something like that? And then another I had was an employee that I hired who is Black, came to work the first day and then never came back and never contacted us again. Where one of my other coworkers who is Black, I think kind of felt like she had to come to me and tell me, oh, not everybody is like that. So it was a little bit awkward, but probably started a good conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would like to commend your colleague who came to you, because she made a brave choice.
Yeah.
You know, and that's, you know, we white people often implicitly, not necessarily meaning to, put the burden on people of color to explain things to us.
Right.
And so just developing our own awareness can help with that. I think it's a compliment to you that your colleague felt, despite the challenge of the topic, that she was willing to share that with you. But it also shows you a little fear she has of being stereotyped herself.
Right.
So to the extent that if you have a situation, and again, this is me speaking, but if I had a situation where a colleague of color trusted me to be that open, I would hope that I would have the presence of mind to thank them for trusting me enough with that message, and to invite them to say, you know, I recognize that I only know what I know, and I hope you feel that it's okay to tell me if I'm making mistakes, because I want to be constantly learning. So I think that's an opportunity. Regarding the other one, I mean, that's so layered. The first level, I'm assuming the argument was between the couple were a male and female, but it may not have been the case.
Correct.
My first reaction is more about, is that woman safe?
Yeah.
You know, and there are ways that wouldn't put you in danger, but also don't involve calling the cops, including just being visible and continuing to watch. They might get insulted and say, are you being a busybody? And you can just, I can actually see me doing this because I've done a lot of clumsy things. So I'm not necessarily suggesting somebody else do this, but I can just see myself being obvious about the fact that I'm watching the argument. And if I get called out on it, just being honest. I wanted to make sure you, ma'am, were safe. And I didn't want to be one of those white women who called the cops. And just, it's amazing how being frank isn't any more awkward than other choices. It doesn't mean it's not awkward, but it may not be any more awkward. But again, that has so many layers. I mean, even doing something like that, unless you're out and open where there are other people, could also be an unsafe choice.
Right.
That could be a domestic violence situation.
Right.
But,
Right.
You know, but I think just the fact that you were aware that, oh my gosh, if I called the cops, this could escalate to something unattended, already shows that you're thinking of things that we as community probably weren't thinking about a year ago. We've learned a lot, even as community.
Jenny, I have to say that we've also had a number of comments to just affirm your bravery, your honesty, again, the buzzword transparency. But
I hate buzzwords.
You know, well, it was your word, a buzzword. But
yeah, I know.
But just simply the openness and the trust that you have in us as an organization, and the confidence that your comments and your shares of, particularly of the family member that was recently violently killed, you know, that we take that very seriously and protect, and it's a safe place for you to share too.
I appreciate that, Mary. That's very, very kind of you to bring that to my attention.
Yes, there were several comments to that regard, and I just wanted to highlight those. I'm not so sure, are there any other remaining questions, Lisa? It looks like that we've gone through all of the questions. There was also an affirmation that the city of YWCA has recently has not an ordinance, but a endorsement in terms of diverse thought. So that was also noted. But Lisa, I think, are we pretty good on the questions at this point?
I think we're good. Yes.
Okay. Well, once again, Jenny, it is just with an amazing, heartfelt thanks that you're spending time. You're clearly working very late tonight. You're still in your office. So that in and of itself is very impressive. I'd like to thank Lisa for fielding and for tracking the questions. And this was a very, very rich meeting, a very engaging meeting. And we certainly accomplished the goal of having a reflective conversation. And that was the intended purpose. So thank you, Jenny. I think this concludes our meeting. There's a postgraduate that's going to be having a lot of information that we announced tonight. So certainly look forward to that. Those of you that want to stay, we're going to put you into breakout rooms if you would like to, or otherwise, this concludes this branch meeting. And thank you very, very much for attending.